So we're recording now. Hello. This is a panel discussing the concept of what an event is and what makes an event significant. Going around the panel, we've got Danielle Hewitt in Bristol, Kate McBain in London, and Eddie Meyer and Phil Jackson both in Brighton. And Andy, who's going to be teaching in Birmingham, will be sort of joining in sort of future panels. Okay, so basically we're just going to look very quickly at the concept of how would you define an event. Do you want to go first, Phil?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about the events and the history of events and how the term has become embedded in our understanding of what it is. The notion of an operating theatre, they were once a paid for spectacle where members of the public could enjoy, engage in the process. But before I moved to the UK, I was living in Australia, and I spent a lot of time, very privileged to spend a lot of time working with a lot of Aboriginal people from a range of different Aboriginal nations. And central to the continuation of their culture and the way that knowledge was passed down was through the performance of corroboree. Now that's a very broad term for a range of ceremonial activity which followed very prescribed rules, but falls outside of what I now see as an event. As a tour manager, I now see an event as a stage, a band, and a group of audience who paid some money to see it. Whereas an Aboriginal corroboree performed an essential part of continuing their culture and passing down knowledge of their culture. So although it is that type of event is outside of our current understanding, in my mind, that was the beginning, that is the beginning of where events have developed from.
That's really, yeah, that's a really interesting start, because so there's like very much cultural differences. I think that's something you were interested in, Kate.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm interested in the concept of an event as opposed to an encounter or an experience, I suppose. And for me, the idea of an event has merged out of that social interaction and people just coming together as part of their everyday and as part of a way of life. I suppose as history has gone on, an event has, for me, become something that's planned. Even to the extent that even a birthday party is both social interaction, but it's also a planned activity. But I think the definition of events comes down to who's defining it. And if you look at some of the theory around events, Getz would argue that an event is an opportunity for leisure, social or cultural experience outside of the normal everyday range of choices, i.e. a special moment in time. But what's special kind of depends on who's defining it. My first time clubbing was very special to me, but for the people on the door, it was probably just a normal work night. So yeah, I think it's a matter of perspective in terms of how we.
So it depends who you are, how you're experiencing whatever it is. Okay, I mean, so Danielle, what are your thoughts on defining what an event is?
I think I'm probably going to echo what Kate just said. It is something that is of significance to us personally, perhaps, but certainly something that happens outside of our everyday routines, something that we can almost pinpoint, but again has a social or cultural or even economic impact on those attending and those around.
Okay, right. So, so we're moving around now. Eddie, have you got anything to add, agree or disagree with there?
I was just thinking to echo what Kate was saying about our first experiences of events, of my first experiences of events and the different kind of categories they'd fall into. So growing up in London, we used to go to the Lord Mayor's Parade. I don't know if any of you know that. Parades are a kind of event, tattoos, changing of the guards, all these kinds of things, they're events of one particular sort. And we also used to go to like steam fairs and motor shows, another kind of event, okay? Different from a parade, but they have certain elements in common. Pride started out as a parade, didn't it? Which is very different again. And then I think other events that I became aware of getting older were obviously concerts and theatre performances, performance-based events, free festivals. Stonehenge Free Festival was a big one, you know, and the ancestor in many ways of a lot of the music events that we have now came from that sort of template, but obviously in certain fundamental ways it was very different. There were no fences, there was no charge. So the kind of relationship between the Free Festival and what they developed into, you can kind of look at that. And also protests as well, like the Stop the City protest was a big thing that happened, and that in itself was an event. It wasn't a parade, it's not a festival, it's not a performance, it had aspects of all those things within it. I guess you could say something like Notting Hill Carnival as well shared some of those kind of characteristics. So, you know, there are different categories which overlap and combine to form what we think of as events.
So events is a very, very broad concept. I think that's what's important for us all to sort of realise, and for new students to realise. It's not just, you know, the last gig I went to and why I went there. Yeah, there's cultural events that sort of reflect cultures, I think, as Phil was just saying. Then there's cultural differences, as Kate was sort of saying as well, and within that probably sort of age differences as well. We've got I'm going to have a guess that there's probably 30 years or more between me and Danielle, and sort of, you know, what was going on when I was 15 and 16 would be quite different from what was going on when Danielle was 15 and 16, unless I'm sort of an awful lot younger than I look, and you're an awful lot older than you look.
Probably I'm older.
But the thing for me about an event is, and certainly in terms of anyone who's, and I'm going to have to write an assignment about it, there's a before, a during, and an after. You know, nothing just emerges out of nowhere. You know, whether it's a style of music, a war, something to protest about. You know, there's a build up to it. That may involve, I think, as Phil was saying, planning. You know, if you're organising a tour, you plan the tour happens, then you reflect on it afterwards. So sometimes it's planning, sometimes a whole series of other things. Probably the biggest event this year, COVID. Who planned that? Yeah. But we're all reacting to it. So there's something to led up to it. There's the event itself, which happens in its own time. For example, I would say Woodstock could only have happened in the late 60s, as it did happen. And that was shown when somebody tried to do a similar thing 30 years later. So it's of its time, and then it has some consequences. And I'm just glad that, Danielle, you've mentioned sort of social and economic consequences. Coming from a sustainability background, I would add environmental consequences. So you get the triple bottom line of social, economic, and environment, which I'm sure will be coming sort of later in this module. What I'd like to move on to, sorry, you were going to say something, Kate?
I was just going to add, actually, because you were talking about how events take place within time, and a lot of that is to do with the tradition that it's kind of emerged out of. So if you think about raves and illegal raves that were happening back in the 80s and 90s, as opposed to raves that are happening now, and other political responses that are actually taking place. And just, you know, last night we were told that we can't actually gather in groups of more than 6, that, you know, there is a direct relationship between the kinds of events that we engage in and we create and the state and society at this much broader level. So I think it's just worth understanding that events should be understood and looked at an individual, a community, and this much bigger societal kind of perspective as well.
Absolutely, and the sort of the rule of 6 people, no more than 6 people, has its own history, going right back to combination acts against trade unions 200 and more years ago, and the rave thing as well. Yeah, somebody organises a sort of a horse race that lots of posh people go to. And that doesn't seem to cause as much upset to the establishment as a couple of dozen teenagers raving in the woods trying to keep away from everybody else. Right. And right now, picking on raves reflects the same thing from the 80s and 90s. Let's pick on raves then as well, for pretty much the same reasons. I think you don't need COVID for the establishment to pick on raves. I just want to move on quickly to sort of, we've got this idea of an event. We're sort of moving culturally from not planning them to planning them, as Phil said. If something builds up to it, it happens, there are some consequences. We've got that. But what makes an event significant, do you think? Would anybody like to jump in and go first on this one?
Just if I could just jump in on the planning element of it, I think even going back to those Aboriginal corroboree, they were not spontaneous happenings. They were actually very rigorously, very carefully planned, that had a very specific narrative that needed to be covered, and had very, very, very strictly enforced roles in terms of who did what, who could be there and who couldn't be there, which in my mind fundamentally defines events, is in that they are always very carefully planned and contemporarily. Some of them aren't as well planned as I would necessarily like, but historically speaking, that seems to be a real strong indicator of an event, is that degree of planning and the degree to which there is a structure that creates it. And moving into more contemporary events, it's a question really for the panel as to what extent is a financial transaction a necessary defining element of an event?
Well, as someone who attended and has organised free festivals, reminded by Eddie before, I don't think that financial transactions are necessary as part of an event, although there's an awful lot of money to be spent and made from events themselves. But again, going back to what Danielle sort of introduced, the sort of the economic, the social, and the environmental, it is part of it, because when I organise free festivals, it still costs money to put it on.
It requires resource, doesn't it? There's always some kind of resource, some kind of transaction, even if it isn't monetary.
Yeah.
An exchange of meaning, an exchange of experience, whatever that might be.
Absolutely. But again, what makes an event significant? We're going to ask people to write about this. Eddie, you're indicating?
Well, I was just picking up on what Kate was just saying. It's the meaning of the event is what makes it significant. And that's how, if you think of my examples like parades or free festivals or protest events or motor fairs, steam, or like the mod scooter rally that we have down here in Brighton, all of these events have a certain meaning. And if you're talking even just about the sort of, the economy of events, that's how events are marketed according to their meaning. Download Festival has a certain meaning, and that's how it's sold. So, and in the broadest possible way, I think what makes an event significant is what it means to the people who are expected to attend.
Yes.
Just following on from that, sorry, Kate. I was going to say, when we're talking about what it means to like those that are attending, the significance doesn't always have to be positive either, because I was thinking in terms of just a recent event that took place would be, or didn't take place, would be Fire Festival. The impacts of that, the significance of that in terms of what it says about how we market events, how we sort of transfer information, the expectation, what we're really selling as an experience. But it's very significant in terms of they couldn't meet those needs of the attendees, or even any of the stakeholders involved, any of the investors, or even staff. So I just thought it was worth bringing up that sometimes it's not always a great significance, but sometimes it can be quite negative as well.
I guess you could say that the meaning is encoded by the event organizers, but it can be decoded by people in different ways.
That's everybody who's involved can have a different view on it.
And that meaning is attached to, and this is the big word, I think, is this idea of identity, and how we identify with an experience or an event prior to it, during it, and afterwards, and how that then impacts on our understanding, excuse me, of who we are, and even more importantly, who we are not. So if you just think about how you may have attacked, like I certainly, when I was clubbing in Glasgow, you were aligned with a particular venue. You would go to this one and you certainly wouldn't go to that one, because there was a particular kind of feeling or meaning attached to those different venues. So the significance of venues, again, like Eddie said, is about meaning and our expression of identity through that. So yeah, and just to pick up on another thing that Phil said in terms of rules, sometimes those rules are inscribed. They're not really evident about how you behave. We create our own rules. You know, we create our own rules about how to behave at particular events, and how you might jump into the mosh pit, or how you might kind of enter a break, you know, a break dancing circle or whatever, because we create these other things ourselves.
That's interesting. I think I want to pick up on, I think it's Danielle's point about it meaning something to you as an individual, because I think what makes something significant, something can be significant to you. I think you've said that a couple of times, Kate. Is it also significant to other people? Is it culturally significant? And the meanings are like that. I mean, what you've just said, Kate, just remind me of being in the press box at a football match between Liverpool and Birmingham City. And you know, they come over, the radio station comes on, let's have a minute or so, how's the game going at Liverpool? And then, you know, the response was very excited. Liverpool have just scored their third goal. This is fantastic. So Birmingham being given a lesson in how to play football, which would have been great if he was talking to Radio Merseyside, but unfortunately he was talking to BRMB in Birmingham, where the meaning of Liverpool's third goal was entirely different.
Exactly.
Those interpretations are really important, you know. So and same thing can happen in any event. Sorry, Phil, you were just going to say.
Well, if I could just jump in on that idea, and then taking it back to cultural origins of events, there is a tribal element to many events. If you look at Morris dancing, for instance, that means very little to someone who isn't interested in Morris dancing, but for someone who has been an avid participant in those events, that particular weekend, their year revolves around that event. So, or for instance, Dave, you're talking about football, as someone who is less connected with sports events. An old neighbor of mine invested far more energy into sports events, and we could hear him screaming through the wall when someone scored a goal, and we'd roll our eyeballs. And the difference in perspectives depends on the tribe you are identifying with. So pride, for instance, is phenomenally significant for a huge range of people. But say, for instance, a trader in Brighton Pride, the difference, the importance of pride for them is because they'll make a ton of money because loads of people come to the city. Whereas a member of the LGBTQ plus community, it's phenomenally important because it affirms their identity, or it gives them an opportunity to celebrate their identity. So perspective and tribalism is a really big part of these.
That's absolutely true. I mean, in Manchester, Pride, as you probably know, is quite a big affair. And I know people who have that feeling because it's that they're part of a community that is being celebrated. I know other people who are quite ambivalent about that community, but their pride is in the fact that there's a major thing happening in Manchester that is including people, even if I don't really know very much about who they are. That in itself, is great, and everybody can see it differently. I think what we've got is identity. Being able to identify with something is important. You know, Eddie mentions free festivals. I didn't go to any of the Stonehenge ones, but I was at Windsor free festivals, being chased away by police officers. You know, so I can identify with what was going on at Stonehenge without having gone there, and so Stonehenge is also significant for me as someone who never went.
And how does that lead on into religion then, I suppose? Because a lot of people celebrate Christmas and they use that opportunity to have all kinds of, social interaction and fun, but they may well just not be religious at all, or connect with that aspect of it. And I suppose that's very common.
I know Jewish people who celebrate Christmas without worrying about the first syllable in the word, particularly. Yeah, everybody's doing this. I don't believe it's a Christian festival. it's bigger than that. Christmas.
It's an interesting question, though, whether you should be a member of a particular community in order to claim ownership or have some kind of significant relationship with a particular festival.
I don't think you need. I think being able to identify with it in some way. I don't think you need to necessarily be at the heart of it to get a lot out and for it to be significant to you.
Yeah.
I mean, I can give you a couple of examples. Given the age I'm at, this goes back to what I was saying about sort of Danielle and myself earlier on. I was born in the 1950s. During the 1960s, there was a sort of a group of 4 young chaps called the Beatles, who made Liverpool cool. Yeah, when I was a kid, Liverpool was probably the coolest place in the world to be from. That changes over the years. By the 1980s, it's the enemy of the government, etc., etc. So I think the Beatles had a massive effect all over the world, but much more in Liverpool. I've never met any of them. I can give you one, and this is not a joke. This happened in our street. Teenage girl gets pregnant. The dad goes mad. Finds out. The girl says, "Well, it's Paul McCartney's," and she's forgiven. Yeah, I'm not saying it was Paul McCartney's, because if every girl in Liverpool in the 60s sort of who claimed Paul McCartney as the parent, then you'd have millions of children probably. But it's something you can identify with, and what would have been a cardinal sin before is, well, it's okay, you can't blame you for having sex with Paul McCartney. Those sort of things. Also, the backdrop. Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, I think it's really important to note that the significance of events changes over time, even though the event may remain there. The way in which we talk about kind of acid house now is kind of with a bit of joviality, and it's slightly different. And we talk about protests in a really nostalgic way, but the significance, even for the people that participated, kind of changes over time.
Yeah, well, I've got 2 other examples, and one of them fits very much with that. First one, I will mention the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp, which changed the nature of protest. Marching around with banners shouting, "We don't like whatever the government is at the moment, and we would prefer this other thing to happen." Still goes on, but protest moved from walking around the streets with banners and shouting to getting stuck in, camping outside the gates of the US Air Force Base, Occupy, camping in Wall Street and in the City of London, Existence Rebellion, doing the stuff. That changed the nature of protest. And most people involved in the current rebellion have never heard of Greenham Common. But it's still incredibly significant. The other one I'd like to throw in is from 1977. I Feel Love by Donna Summer.
Oh, great song.
Changed music, changed popular music as dramatically as Bob Dylan had done 10 or 15 years before, because it took us from disco to what became known as electronic dance music. And there is an argument that no Donna Summer and Giorgio Moroder, no raves in the 80s. These are the sort of connections I would like people to make. But basically, it's individual identification issues and then bigger cultural issues is, I think, what makes something significant.
Thinking
Phil,
about, just connecting disco and events particularly. I remember so I was born in the late 60s, and in the mid 70s, there was a movement which I didn't really understand, but it sounded kind of funny, which was Disco Sucks. I remember really enjoying music that I didn't know was called disco, but I thought it was really nice, it had a really good beat. And then suddenly everybody started saying Disco Sucks, and that became kind of the cool thing. And someone, I think he was in Chicago, organized a Disco Sucks event, which destroyed the careers of hundreds and thousands of artists as a result of what was sort of a kind of almost a throwaway expression. So the impact of events can be I mean, I know this almost goes without saying, but I just remember watching a documentary where a very prominent artist from the disco scene from Chic, Nile Rodgers, was talking about his life was destroyed by that event where disco records were blown up in an arena in I think Chicago.
And as Danielle said, it can be significant. We are very much running out of time. I've mentioned a couple of things that I thought was significant events. Anybody, if we go around, anybody? Danielle, what's been significant in your lifetime?
To me, I mean, and it really is a personal event. And actually, it's something that like Kate said, who am I before, sort of during, and who am I after? And I think it was in 2004, I went to see Bon Jovi in Hyde Park. And it was the first time that I had ever gone to a concert on that scale, I think, or certainly outdoors. I think maybe I saw Robbie Williams in the Millennium Stadium. I was forced, I will say that, I was dragged. But to see Bon Jovi, a band that I loved, and to be in that crowd, and also I went with my cousin, two of my cousins, and we wore these little matching t-shirts, and we had a sign, and we sort of got as far to the barrier as we could. And I still just remember that incredible moment where I was just in a crowd of people, and that connection, I think that was, for me, of such significance that it put me on the career path to work in the music industry. It was such a transformative experience, but obviously that's just individual.
Yeah, that's fine, but an awful lot of individuals will have had that kind of experience at Bon Jovi or Robbie Williams gigs.
Yes. But it's so strange thinking, like, I may have been at a big concert, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't the same significance as it was to see someone that I loved, and perhaps with the people that I loved, and just those little things that kind of make it a really significant and transformative experience.
Anybody else want to throw one in? Go on, Ed.
I was going to suggest Marshmallow on Fortnite. It's, even though I wasn't there, it's a new sort of event.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
You know, and we're talking, you know, if we're talking about significant protest movements, you know, with Extinction Rebellion or Occupy before that, maybe the actual efficacy of these sort of protests has been slightly called into question. You know, people come, they camp, they go. You know, we've seen it happen again and again. Big music events that had a, you know, a certain sort of, I think there's indecision about what the cultural significance of big music events, if they came from Glastonbury and the Isle of Wight and Stonehenge Free Festival and the Windsor Festival, and now it's British Summertime in Hyde Park. You know, that's kind of where it's gone. And so we're sort of thinking events to event management student has a very specific kind of meaning, doesn't it? Generally involving a portaloo, some high vis, you know, a walkie-talkie and a load of Harris fencing. If it's got one or all of those things, that's what an event means. You know, and you'll have the same kind of crew will do, you know, a military tattoo, they'll do a rock festival, they'll do a legal rave, they'll do a dog show, you know, they'll do some sort of big show-off thing for the Emir of Dubai. You know, it's the same crew doing the same kind of thing. But if you think of Marshmallow on Fortnite, this is a new sort of event.
Yeah.
You know?
Okay, I think we're going to have to leave it there. So we've been talking now for 25 minutes. We're probably going to carry on talking once I've stopped the recording for another 25. Okay, Kate, you want to say something before?
I just want to ask students at one point to compare, bearing in mind that, you know, we've had some recent announcements. Compare the great exhibition of 1851 and the soon-to-be Festival Brexit 2022.
Is that still happening?
It's been announced again that it's going to be happening. The announcement was yesterday, and I would just like students to think about how a particular kind of event may suit a particular point in time, a particular kind of society, a particular kind of community, and it's really important to acknowledge that events are born of their time, if you like, and it isn't necessarily possible to transplant these things.
Okay, thanks. That in itself would lead on to an interesting discussion. I'm sure we'll continue. The plan is to continue with some of these panel discussions anyway. I think that we'll just call it. We'll call it a day there. So thanks everybody, and also students. enjoy the course. Don't just do it, enjoy it and get something from it. Thank you.